me one more time. Renee Good.
Tensions remain high in Minneapolis as protesters and federal agents continued to clash over the weekend, 5 days after the fatal shooting of a woman by an ICE agent. Over 24 people were arrested over the weekend in Minneapolis as protests spread all across the country. Here to discuss the latest is The Hill's Deputy Managing Editor, Sarakshi Rai. Hey, Sarakshi. So we've seen intense video of clashes between protesters and law enforcement across Minneapolis. Governor Tim Walz urging locals not to let violence distract from the shooting of Renee Good. She's the woman that was killed by the ICE agent. After the protests, have protests been largely peaceful, or are there concerns that this could start to spin out of control?
That's right, Drew. By and large, these protests have remained largely very peaceful. There's been this push from some of the protesters to ensure that, they don't have another incident like what took place 5 days ago with the fatal shooting of Renee Good. Now, what we've seen is that, there have been a few incidents where there's been some scuttle and tear gas moments like with law enforcement agents that we saw in the clip earlier. But by and large, protests remaining largely peaceful, and they yet haven't reached the same scale that we saw a few years ago with the George Floyd protests, or even the protests in California at the start of the Trump administration last year. So by and large, everyone kind of staying largely peaceful for now, Drew.
Some Democrats are amping up the rhetoric against ICE. Representative Ilhan Omar calling it an occupying force. Some Democrats are floating the idea of withholding ICE funding. What do we know about these conversations, and how united is the party in that?
That's right, Drew. The party isn't very united on this front. We know that ICE's operational budget increased by triple because of the president's big, beautiful bill that was passed and signed into law last year. Now, what we've seen is some calls from Democrats like Ilhan Omar calling for them to slash ICE's funding. But, so far what we've heard from Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the two Dems in leadership positions at the House and Senate, is that, so far they aren't really talking about any of that. We also heard from Virginia Senator Mark Warner, who said that, given that the country has just come out of the longest shutdown, which lasted over 30 days, he is kind of, not very keen to reintroduce anything that could see a battle for this shutdown extended because of this ICE funding battle. So the Democrats really not largely united behind this call to slash ICE funding. But what we have seen is that, there are concerned about the shooting, and they have issued statements of support for Renee Good. But so far, it's very few Democrats currently calling for this slash of ICE funding, Drew.
Now, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is saying her department will send hundreds more agents into Minneapolis. What will that look like, and what's the justification there?
That's right, Drew. So what we're hearing from Kristi Noem is that she says that, there is a law and order concern, and these extra agents are to ensure that law and order is maintained in the city. And so, there's no real concern from the Trump administration over sending more agents. Now, we do know, obviously, the mayor, Jacob Frey, has said that, he wants ICE to get out of the city. But, so far, at least Noem, DHS, and ICE currently, sending more enforcement officers in just so that there's their justification is that they maintain law and order.
Has there been any concern inside the Trump administration regarding Secretary Noem and her response to the shooting, calling Good a domestic terrorist?
That's right. By and large, we've seen the Trump administration stand firmly behind Kristi Noem. We also heard from Vice President J.D. Vance earlier, who, came and made this pitch to America from the White House and the press briefing room of the White House, where he really backed the law enforcement agents and the ICE agents and the moves that the ICE agents did. They have characterized Renee Good as an agitator, a political agitator, and they've said that while the shooting was unfortunate, it was avoidable, and she was, directly endangering the ICE agents. So very firmly, the Trump administration is behind Kristi Noem and the ICE agents and the ICE agency by and large, Drew.
The backlash over the shooting made its way into Hollywood last night at the Golden Globes, with stars like Mark Ruffalo and Ariana Grande wearing pins to honor Good. What was the reaction to this from Trump's defenders?
That's right. We saw a lot of celebrities like Mark Ruffalo. We saw Wanda Sykes. We saw Jean Smart. They were all wearing pins called "Be Good," which directly, reference the shooting that took place 5 days ago. We also heard Mark Ruffalo really, talk about just how disappointed he was. He criticized the president and he questioned what was happening in the United States as well. But we did hear from Stephen Chung, who is on the White House communications team, in a tweet where he said that Mark Ruffalo is one of the worst human beings and he's spewing outright lies, and he criticized his acting abilities and his performance. So very clearly, the administration and the communications staff really, like Stephen Chung, standing behind the administration's stance on this issue and criticizing celebrities for making the Golden Globes about politics.
As we near the second week of the aftermath of this shooting, what should we be keeping an eye on in Minneapolis and here in D.C. in terms of the investigations into the shooting?
That's right. By and large, we've seen that, the Trump administration has released a video from the officer's point of view, which, despite its release, really has not made any difference in terms of just the reaction from the people and the outrage that people have been expressing over the shooting of Renee Good. We've also seen, that there will be an investigation. We've seen, protests take place around the country, including in D.C. over the weekend. So that's something to keep an eye on to see whether or not, these protests continues, whether they spread to different cities, and also, how the administration handles the investigation into the shooting. And if the public thinks that the investigation, there's some concern that they believe that, the investigation might just be, it might just end up the way the administration wants it, because, the administration is firmly behind ICE and its agents and say that it was a justified shooting, Drew.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Sarakshi Rai, thanks so much for your time.